What if I told you that thousands of children were once used in secret medical experiments, without their knowledge, without their parents' consent, and hidden away for decades? This is a chapter of history most were never meant to know. Before we begin, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments as we uncover this story together. He began in the archives. The story opened not with a single secret, but in many public records, government files, hospital statements, and the notes of researchers who had walked through remote communities and school dining halls. In the mid-20th century, a constellation of medical institutions, colonial administrations, and philanthropic organizations had been reshaping public health policy across North America. Their work ranged from tuberculosis campaigns and school health inspections to surveys of diet and growth. Within those ordinary administrative acts, scholars later identified a darker pattern. Research projects carried out on indigenous populations, studies in which malnutrition, inadequate funding, and scientific experimentation intersected in ways that would haunt survivors and their descendants. The most well-documented episode in Canada took place between 1942 and 1952. During that decade, teams of nutritionists and physicians conducted surveys and controlled interventions in remote Cree communities in northern Manitoba and in 6 Indian residential schools across several provinces. Historians who later examined government records and hospital archives counted roughly 1,300 Indigenous participants in these programs, of whom about 1,000 were children. The investigators measured bodies, took blood samples and X-rays, recorded dietaries and growth, and in some sites administered supplemental vitamins to some groups while withholding them from others for the purposes of comparison. Contemporary medical reports and later archival research show that these projects were presented then as investigations into the causes and remedies of endemic malnutrition. Archival evidence shows that the practices sometimes involved withholding nutrients from already hungry children for comparative study. The conduct and authorization of the studies were embedded in public institutions. Documents indicate that Department of Indian Affairs officials, provincial health authorities, and hospital researchers collaborated on surveys and interventions. Some of the surveys and follow-up investigations were carried out by physicians affiliated with prominent pediatric hospitals and universities. Hospital statements and later reconciliations acknowledge that clinicians from those institutions played leading roles in the work. The projects were not secret in the sense of being wholly undocumented. They appear in departmental files, field reports, and the published and unpublished notes of the investigators. But the surviving records also show gaps, limited consent processes, and minimal involvement of parents or communities in decisions about experimental procedures. A historian named Ian Mosby unearthed much of the documentary evidence now central to this history. His archival research, later published in scholarly articles, reconstructed the sequence of surveys and experiments. Initial surveys in northern Manitoba in 1942 that documented severe food insecurity, a larger James Bay survey in 1947–48, and experimental feeding programs and comparative studies in residential schools through the late 1940s and early 1950s. Mosby and others emphasized that these studies took place against a background in which Indigenous children were already underfed by government and church-run institutions, a context that made ethical safeguards all the more necessary and, in many cases, all the more absent. Medical institutions that later issued statements of reconciliation or historical review acknowledged their part in the record. The Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto, for example, confirmed that in the 1940s and 1950s one of its physicians, Frederick Tisdall, led nutritional studies on malnourished Indigenous populations and at residential schools on behalf of the Federal Department of Indian Affairs. The hospital recognized that essential vitamins were withheld from some children during research protocols, and that regular medical examinations could have been confusing, painful, and traumatic for those children. Across the Atlantic and in other North American settings, the 20th century's major philanthropic foundations, among them the Rockefeller Foundation, invested heavily in public health, medical education, and disease control. Archival annual reports and institutional histories document long-running programs in medical education, agricultural science, hookworm control, and public health infrastructure. Those records show a pattern of large philanthropic investments intended to professionalize medicine, expand laboratory science, and promote public health campaigns in many countries. But the surviving record for Canada's residential school nutrition studies does not primarily list the Rockefeller Foundation as the sponsor of those experiments. Contemporary sponsors and supporters named in government and hospital files include the Department of Indian Affairs, provincial health departments, university researchers, and other charitable funds such as the Millbank Memorial Fund. The experiment's design and conduct raised profound ethical questions. Reports and later bioethical commentary compared the Canadian studies to other infamous cases of unethical human experimentation of the same era. Commentators noted that these projects were conducted at a time when standards for informed consent were far less developed than they are today. But they also pointed out that consent or consultation with parents and communities was often absent even by the standards of the day. Publications in medical journals and ethics reviews called for formal investigations and apologies, arguing that the vulnerable status of the subjects, children in state-run or church-run schools, already suffering from poverty and malnutrition, rendered the experiments ethically unconscionable. Survivors' testimony and Indigenous communities' demands for redress have been central to bringing this history into public view. Members of affected communities and former students of residential schools recounted memories of hunger, irregular diets, intrusive medical examinations, and experiments that singled out some children for supplementation while others received less. These oral histories and testimonies were given during truth and reconciliation proceedings, in media interviews, and in archived depositions. They supplemented the documentary record with lived accounts that historians used to correlate administrative files with conditions on the ground. These testimony records understood that the experiments were experienced not as abstract scientific studies, but as interventions affecting real children in institutions from which they could seldom leave. The next pages of the institutional record traced consequences. Some investigators and officials after the fact argued that the research produced knowledge about nutrition and vitamin deficiencies that informed public health interventions. Critics responded that the knowledge could not justify the methods used, especially when those methods involved comparative withholding of nutrients from children who had already been undernourished. The debate over scientific benefit versus ethical cost became a recurrent theme in subsequent inquiries and in calls for apologies and reparations. Academic articles and policy discussions have framed these studies alongside international conversations about the ethics of research on vulnerable populations, a conversation that increasingly demanded formal oversight, consent, and community engagement. Yet archival silence persisted in places. Some expected records were missing or fragmentary. Correspondence with parents, explicit consent forms, and detailed protocols for every school remain incomplete or absent in public archives. Those silences complicated efforts to map precisely who authorized each procedure and to what extent outside philanthropic actors influenced specific projects. Careful historians therefore distinguished between documented institutional roles, who signed memos, who filed reports, and broader associations of philanthropic power and influence in 20th century medicine. That distinction is important for grounding any narrative that seeks to describe what occurred and who was responsible. From these scattered documents, public statements, and survivor testimonies, a portrait emerged of children in institutional settings, of public health officials and hospital clinicians who treated and studied them, and of a research environment that sometimes prioritized scientific questions over the rights and welfare of the subjects. The material record, government files, hospital reconciliation statements, published historical studies, provided the foundation for a narrative that would move from administrative memoranda to field surveys, from feeding protocols to the voices of those who lived through the policies. Investigators first mapped the bodies they found. Field teams documented heights and weights, recorded arm and chest measurements, took photographs for clinical purposes, and drew blood for laboratory assays. They recorded diets in painstaking daily logs, listing the scant rations available in school kitchens and family homes. X-rays, where available, were taken as a routine diagnostic tool for conditions such as tuberculosis, but they were also used to gather comparative clinical data across groups. The instruments of medicine, scales, measuring tapes, syringes, X-ray plates, laboratory forms, became the language of inquiry that translated hunger into numbers. These measurements, when assembled on tables, informed the experimental designs that followed. The experimental designs themselves ranged from observational surveys to controlled feeding interventions. In some settings, investigators instituted supplementary feeding programs intended to raise caloric intake and to test whether targeted nutritional intervention would change growth trajectories and disease resistance. In other locations, the implementation was comparative. Some children received fortified or additional foodstuffs and vitamins, while others continued on the institutional diet. The stated scientific aim was to measure the effects of specific nutrients on growth, blood markers, and resistance to infection. The lived reality, however, was shaped by the constraints of understaffed kitchens, supply shortages, and the institutional hierarchies that limited children's access to alternate food sources. Authorization for the work threaded through bureaucratic memos and hospital correspondence. Departmental officials issued letters permitting surveys and medical inspections. Provincial public health officers coordinated with visiting clinicians, and physicians working for pediatric hospitals lent their names and laboratory resources. The hospital clinicians supplied reagents, laboratory space, and technical guidance for analyzing blood and tissue samples. In practice, authority was fragmented. Local school principals, church authorities, and government health inspectors each exercised control over daily life in the institutions where research occurred. The interplay of these authorities meant that decisions about who would be examined, who would be given supplements, and who would not, were often made in meetings recorded as routine administrative business. Consent, as a procedure or principle, was inconsistently documented. Where some files contained cursory notations of parental notification or administrative approval, many more bore no record of informed parental consent as it is understood today. Instead, archives showed administrative approvals issued by officials and church superintendents. Some families were remote and had limited capacity to contest or decline what occurred within school walls. Testimony collected later made clear that many children and families did not understand that measured differences in diet were part of an experimental comparison, nor that some children were being deliberately given additional nutrients while others were not. In recollections, routine medical checks and the arrival of researchers were indistinguishable from the compulsion of institutional life. Field reports reveal practical constraints that shaped the experiments. Cold storage was limited in northern outposts. Deliveries of supplemental foodstuffs could be delayed or lost in transit, and local kitchens operated on meager budgets. Investigators therefore worked against a backdrop of scarcity that complicated experimental controls. When a team recorded improvements in the height or weight of supplemented children, they also acknowledged that sporadic supplies and seasonal variations in hunting and fishing meant that no single factor could be wholly isolated. Still, the protocols pursued, measuring, withholding, supplementing, were deliberate scientific choices, not merely responses to logistic failure. Debates within the medical correspondence show a tension between clinical intention and scientific method. Some clinicians argued privately that comparative methods were necessary to determine causal relationships. Without control groups, they insisted, one could not conclude whether a particular vitamin or food produced improvement. Other contemporaries, and many later commentators, argued that placing children in controlled comparative groups when they were known to be undernourished violated basic duties of care. The exchanges captured in minutes and letters disclosed differing views about risk, benefit, and the moral obligations that accompany the physician's work among vulnerable populations. The institutional record also preserved evidence of how the work was explained to some audiences. Annual reports emphasized the public health imperatives. Endemic malnutrition threatened child development and community health, and medical research could guide better feeding programs and health services. Public-facing language framed the inquiries as remedial, scientific, and necessary for policy formation. The internal language of notebooks and inter-office communications was often more utilitarian, recording the steps taken to assemble cohorts, schedule examinations, and ship samples to distant laboratories. Survivor testimony and community memory filled gaps the archives could not. Former students and community members remembered cues at school kitchens, the ritual of being weighed, the anxiety of repeated examinations, and the bewildering sight of some children receiving extra portions while others did not. For many, the acts of measurement and supplementation left psychological as well as physical marks. The remembrance of singled-out children, the humiliation of inspection, and the long aftertaste of institutional hunger. Oral histories collected in subsequent decades became crucial to reconstructing what the numbers alone could not show, the emotional and social contexts in which experimentation occurred. As the decades passed, the historical work of piecing together these events deepened. Historians and investigative journalists assembled institutional records, interviewed survivors, and cross-checked hospital personnel lists against departmental travel logs. This archival labor produced a tighter chronology and clarified the institutional actors involved, though it also revealed silences, missing correspondence, fragmented protocols, and administrative paperwork that had never been preserved. Those absences shaped later public arguments about responsibility and accountability. When a piece of the chain of command could not be fully traced, scholars and advocates focused on the documented roles of the institutions that remained visible on file. The trail of paper led into the northern landscapes themselves. Teams traveled by train, boat, and plane into communities along the Nelson River and in the James Bay region. These were places where food was already scarce, where seasonal hunting and fishing governed survival, and where families had long endured the impacts of disrupted land access and colonial restrictions. Researchers arrived with measuring instruments and notebooks, accompanied at times by government agents and interpreters. Their presence marked both medical inquiry and administrative oversight, a union of science and colonial authority. In 1942, the first extensive survey in northern Manitoba revealed what investigators termed endemic malnutrition. Field notes recorded that children had distended bellies, chronic fatigue, dental decay, and skin conditions linked to dietary deficiency. The community's reliance on limited store-bought goods, alongside dwindling access to wild game, compounded hunger. The research team documented everything: caloric intake, the frequency of meat consumption, the proportion of families subsisting on flour, lard, and sugar. These records were clinical in tone, but behind each entry lay families rationing food and children showing visible signs of deprivation. When the James Bay survey followed 5 years later, the pattern was repeated on a larger scale. Researchers, many of them physicians with academic or hospital affiliations, examined entire cohorts of Cree families. They noted deficiencies in vitamins A and C, riboflavin, and niacin. Some reports described early signs of rickets and anemia in children. Laboratory samples were shipped south for analysis, while in the field, examinations were conducted in makeshift clinics set up in community halls or schoolrooms. Children lined up for inspection, while parents observed with a mixture of compliance, curiosity, and unease. From these surveys grew the logic for intervention. Officials reasoned that controlled supplementation could test whether targeted nutrients would reverse deficiencies. The communities themselves had little role in shaping that decision. The studies designed in distant offices translated into lived experience on the ground. Some children received milk powder enriched with vitamins, others received placebos or continued on their previous diet. School kitchens became experimental sites, their menus adjusted according to research protocols. Cooks and staff, themselves struggling with inadequate supplies, were instructed to maintain strict separations between groups, ensuring that the differences remained measurable. The bureaucratic machinery behind these interventions involved correspondence across multiple layers. Letters moved from federal offices in Ottawa to provincial health authorities, from hospital administrators to local school principals. Researchers submitted requisition forms for food supplies, supplements, and laboratory equipment. Delays in transport, spoiled shipments, and the difficulty of keeping perishable goods in remote northern settings forced adjustments that are visible in the surviving documents. Yet the commitment to maintain control and comparison groups remained intact, even when logistical challenges made the interventions inconsistent. The children's memories, preserved decades later in testimony, evoke an atmosphere not captured in the medical notes. They recalled hunger so persistent that extra food given to some classmates sparked resentment and confusion. Some remembered being told to line up for blood tests and examinations without explanation. Others spoke of the bitterness of cod liver oil or the unfamiliar taste of powdered milk. These recollections did not always align neatly with the scientific record, but together they painted a fuller picture. Children subjected to procedures they could not understand, in institutions where choice and consent were absent. The archival evidence also shows that administrators often regarded these interventions as efficient tools to address a practical problem: high costs of relief and medical care in northern districts. Nutritional science was meant to identify the cheapest, most effective way to sustain populations at a subsistence level. The experiments, framed as advancing public health, were also experiments in colonial governance, determining how little could be provided while maintaining bodily survival. The school corridors carried the scent of thin porridge and boiled starch. Kitchens worked with sacks of flour and small allotments of dried milk, sometimes bulk commodities provided by the federal government. It was in these dining halls that the experimental protocols were carried out most intensely. Menus were altered, servings portioned with deliberate calculation, and the children were instructed to eat without question. In some schools, vitamin-enriched flour was introduced to the meals of select groups. Teachers and cooks were given instructions to monitor which children ate from which batch of bread. Others continued to consume the ordinary flour, deficient in essential nutrients. In another institution, Powdered milk was added to the diets of a chosen group, while the rest received no supplement. The daily act of eating, which for most children already meant enduring meager rations, became a site of controlled comparison. The documentation shows how tightly these regimes were managed. Researchers required principals and staff to report on compliance, to ensure that children did not trade food between tables or sneak portions from one group to another. School supervisors sometimes punished those who disobeyed. Every variation risked spoiling the data. The children, though unaware of the categories into which they had been placed, learned quickly that food was not only scarce but unequally distributed. Medical teams returned periodically to measure outcomes. They inspected teeth for signs of decay, noted the condition of hair and skin, and checked for bleeding gums and brittle nails. Blood samples were drawn to test hemoglobin levels and vitamin content. These sessions often brought fear. Children were lined up, sleeves rolled back, needles introduced without comfort or explanation. Records noted the results in precise figures, while the memory for many remained one of pain and confusion. One experiment involved the deliberate withholding of dental care. Investigators wanted to measure the natural progression of tooth decay in malnourished children. Dentists were instructed not to provide treatment, even when cavities caused pain, because intervention would interfere with the study. The official notes described control conditions. Survivor accounts recalled suffering in silence, the ache of untreated mouths becoming a daily burden. Behind the scenes, correspondence among researchers reflected the scientific ambition driving these methods. They debated which nutrients might most efficiently raise growth curves, how deficiencies revealed themselves differently in northern climates, and how their findings might inform national policy. Letters sent to Ottawa emphasized the potential for wide application. If the minimal diets of Indigenous children could be adjusted scientifically, the results could guide standards for schools, hospitals, and relief programs across the country. The cost calculations were never far from these discussions. Budgets showed that officials sought inexpensive, scalable solutions. Enriched flour, fortified milk, and cod liver oil capsules were not merely nutritional interventions but economic experiments, testing how little could be added to sustain development. The children became the means through which economic efficiency and scientific curiosity were pursued. At the same time, silence hung over questions of ethics. Nowhere in the surviving files was there evidence that families had been consulted or informed of the experimental nature of the feeding regimes. School superintendents and church authorities signed approvals. Principals cooperated with hospital physicians. The parents, often hundreds of miles away, had no voice in whether their children became part of an experiment. In the lives of the children, these distinctions of policy and science collapsed into the simple reality of hunger. Some remembered staring at plates, aware that others had been given extra bread or richer milk. Others recalled the constant gnawing emptiness that no portion seemed to satisfy. For many, the unequal distribution fostered resentment that lingered for years. Hunger was not only a physical sensation but a lesson in inequity, absorbed daily at the dinner table. The laboratories in southern cities received crates of samples from the schools. Bottles of blood, dental charts, and sheets of anthropometric measurements were packed into parcels and shipped along rail lines to university departments and hospital basements. Technicians logged them into ledgers, assigning numbers to children whose names were reduced to initials. In those rooms, under fluorescent lamps, the children's hunger was transformed into hemoglobin counts, vitamin assays, and statistical tables. Researchers published some of their findings in medical journals, framing them as contributions to nutritional science. They reported on rates of anemia, the prevalence of cavities, the impact of fortified milk, and the deficiencies detected in northern diets. These papers were written in the clinical register of science, devoid of the lived context. Where children remembered the sting of needles or the ache of untreated teeth, the articles recorded only the percentage of improvement or decline. The circulation of these studies within academic and policy networks helped solidify reputations. Physicians who had led the interventions cited the results in lectures, conferences, and policy meetings. Some gained recognition as experts in child nutrition. Their careers advanced on the basis of data gathered in institutions where children had no power to refuse. The institutions that hosted them, universities, hospitals, and government departments, archived the correspondence as evidence of their contribution to modern science. Hospital records show that some of the researchers involved held prominent positions in pediatric medicine. Their names later appeared in histories of medical innovation, remembered for contributions to dietary standards and food fortification. Only decades later did a fuller accounting of how those contributions were obtained come to light, when scholars returned to the archives and traced the origins of the data back to residential schools and remote indigenous communities. Policy officials in Ottawa absorbed the findings into deliberations on relief programs. Reports highlighted that specific vitamin deficiencies were common, that simple supplements could produce measurable improvement, and that fortification of staple foods might be extended to broader populations. Yet the cost-saving orientation remained clear. The experiments were seen not as a warning about systemic underfeeding, but as confirmation that carefully measured additions could sustain minimal health at low expense. Meanwhile, the children who had been subjects grew into adulthood, carrying the marks of deprivation. Testimonies later given to commissions described chronic health problems, weakened teeth, and memories of being treated as objects rather than patients. Some linked lifelong struggles with nutrition and well-being to the years when their diets had been regulated for scientific comparison. Others spoke of mistrust, a wariness of hospitals and doctors rooted in childhood experiences of being examined and experimented upon without consent. The silence of the archives was mirrored by the silence of the institutions themselves during those decades. No public acknowledgement was made. The work was framed as ordinary science, folded into the broader narrative of medical progress. The names of Indigenous children did not appear in the citations, only the aggregated data that allowed researchers to speak with authority on malnutrition. By the mid-1950s, the experiments began to taper off. Nutritional research moved toward large-scale fortification programs and population-wide dietary surveys. The specific feeding trials in residential schools faded from active policy, their records filed away. For the institutions that had overseen them, it was a closed chapter. For the children, now grown, the consequences remained an open wound. The archives for the later 1940s and early 1950s reveal a widening circle of institutional involvement. By this stage, the feeding trials had been implemented across multiple schools in different provinces, and the machinery of government bureaucracy was fully engaged. Files show interdepartmental correspondence moving between the Department of Indian Affairs, the federal health authorities, and the principals of the church-run institutions. Hospitals and university departments received copies of interim results. Every layer of authority reinforced the continuity of the experiments, embedding them into the daily routines of children who could neither question nor escape them. Within the schools themselves, The programs unfolded with an exacting regularity. Cooks, often women working with very limited resources, were tasked with following directives they had not devised. Some kitchens were instructed to use flour enriched with riboflavin or niacin, while others were told to maintain the standard unfortified supplies as a control. Reports noted how these cooks sometimes struggled to enforce the rules. Children shared food across tables, or hid portions to trade later, threatening the controlled comparisons. When supervisors discovered these transgressions, punishment followed: confiscated portions, loss of privileges, sometimes corporal discipline. For the children, food was both a necessity and a battleground, its unequal distribution creating friction among peers. Medical examinations punctuated the school calendar. Visiting physicians and their assistants brought portable scales, blood drawing kits, and dental instruments. Children were lined up, often in classrooms converted temporarily into clinics. Some remembered being stripped down to underwear for full body measurements, the sense of exposure magnified by the authority of strangers with clipboards. The blood draws, repeated periodically, were described in later testimony as especially traumatic. A sharp prick, the filling of tubes, and no explanation offered in terms they could understand. Notes in the researchers' files were terse: hemoglobin count, deficiency confirmed, follow-up recommended. But behind each entry was a child left frightened or in pain. Dental examinations revealed cavities and advanced decay in large numbers. Internal reports show that, in certain trial sites, treatment was deliberately withheld. Dentists were directed to record the progress of decay rather than intervene, so that the natural history of dental disease under conditions of malnutrition could be observed. For the children, this meant enduring toothaches for months, sometimes years, without relief. Survivor accounts decades later described this as among the most cruel aspects of the studies: the constant ache of untreated teeth, coupled with the knowledge that adults in white coats had seen their suffering and done nothing. The administrative correspondence from this phase underscores the scientific ambition driving the work. Researchers debated how to balance rigor with feasibility in remote conditions. One memo described the difficulty of maintaining strict separation between experimental and control groups, while another proposed adjusting statistical methods to account for contamination when children shared food. These documents reveal the mindset of investigators. Children were units in a study, variables to be controlled or adjusted, rather than individuals whose rights or consent required consideration. The bureaucratic language was technical, efficient, and devoid of empathy. For government officials, the results promised a tool for policy. Internal reports highlighted that small, inexpensive interventions could measurably alter growth and health indicators. Such findings had obvious appeal to administrators seeking to minimize expenditure on indigenous welfare. By quantifying the impact of fortified flour or powdered milk, officials believed they could calculate the cheapest way to sustain life in residential schools and northern communities. Cost efficiency became entwined with medical authority, justifying ongoing underfunding of food supplies by presenting scientific evidence that only minor supplements were necessary. The wider context of colonial administration amplified the effects. Indigenous families were already subject to restrictions on hunting and fishing, which reduced access to traditional foods. Federal relief budgets for reserves were meager, often below subsistence levels. Residential schools operated on chronically inadequate funding, producing institutionalized hunger that survivors later described in vivid detail. Thin soup, bread so stale it crumbled, watery porridge with little nutrition. Into this environment, The experiments did not bring genuine remedy, but instead added layers of scrutiny and unequal feeding. Hunger became both the condition to be studied and the instrument of study itself. The professional networks of the researchers ensured that their findings circulated beyond the schools. Conferences on child health and nutrition in the late 1940s included papers referencing controlled observations in northern populations. These papers did not name the schools or communities, but the data derived from them. Researchers earned professional recognition, citing their work as pioneering studies of malnutrition in isolated populations. Their careers advanced, while the subjects of their studies remained anonymous, identified only through numbers and averages. In the communities themselves, memories of this phase were etched into the bodies of children. Some recalled fainting from weakness during school days, only to be revived and measured again as data points. Others remembered the bitterness of supplements they were told to swallow, while classmates sitting beside them received none. The atmosphere of scarcity deepened resentment. Why did one child receive extra portions while another went hungry? These divisions, artificially created by experimental design, left scars that extended beyond childhood. Testimony decades later revealed how siblings had been separated into different feeding groups, creating rifts that lingered into adulthood. The correspondence between officials and researchers from these years carried no discussion of consent. There were no letters requesting parental approval, no forms outlining risks or benefits. Decisions were made at the administrative level, communicated downward through principals and superintendents, and carried out in kitchens and classrooms. Families, when they learned of the interventions at all, were given only fragments of information, often after the fact. Silence surrounded the ethical dimension, as if the children's lack of choice was an unquestioned aspect of colonial governance. While the medical data accumulated in binders and journals, the human costs remained unrecorded in official files. Yet oral histories and survivor testimony, gathered many decades later, filled these silences. Former students remembered being treated as specimens, their hunger used against them. Some spoke of the shame they felt being examined in front of peers, or the fear of needles that haunted them into adulthood. Others emphasized the betrayal they felt when, later in life, they discovered that their deprivation had been engineered not only by neglect but by deliberate design for research. By the early 1950s, the experiments had run their course in several schools, but the methods and mentality persisted in policy. Nutritional science, enriched by data taken from Indigenous children, informed national decisions about food fortification and child health standards. The knowledge entered textbooks and guidelines without acknowledgement of its origins. The children's bodies had been the laboratories, but their names disappeared from the scientific record. What remained was an enduring legacy of mistrust. Communities that remembered the intrusion of scientists and officials, the manipulation of food, and the withholding of care. By the early 1950s, the results of the nutrition trials had begun to circulate widely in policy and academic circles, but within the schools, the impact on children deepened. Hunger remained a constant, and the experiments layered additional burdens onto already difficult lives. Survivor testimony collected much later often described those years as a blur of scarcity, routine medical intrusions, and the sense that their bodies were never fully their own. The medical files show that some of the researchers involved presented their findings to federal committees on child welfare and public health. They argued that fortifying staple foods, flour, milk, margarine, offered a cost-effective way to reduce deficiencies. What went unspoken in those presentations was the method by which the data had been gathered. that children had been divided, some deliberately deprived of supplements, their illnesses and discomfort tracked for years. The professional tone of these reports stripped away the reality of lived suffering. Numbers were tidy, conclusions clear, while the children themselves remained faceless. Inside the schools, the experimental protocols reshaped daily existence. Food was already sparse, but now it was also regulated with greater precision. Principals received letters with instructions about portions and ingredients. Some children were given enriched bread, others the ordinary kind. Supervisors patrolled dining rooms to ensure compliance. A child who tried to share might be scolded, punished, or even struck. Meals became not only a source of sustenance, but a visible reminder of inequality, an inequality enforced in the name of science. Medical visits continued on a schedule. Teams returned with their instruments, repeating measurements and recording changes. Children remembered being called out of class, standing in line, stripped for exams, and bled for samples. For some, these visits were more frightening than the punishments of teachers. The sharpness of needles, the cold stethoscopes, the way strangers touched their bodies, all carried into adulthood as visceral memories. In the official notes, those moments were reduced to statistics: hematocrit levels, growth percentiles, dental scores. Researchers sent their data south, where laboratories transformed it into tables and graphs. Reports compiled during this phase became foundational references for nutrition science in Canada. They demonstrated, for instance, that specific deficiencies could be addressed by small-scale fortification. But they also showed the persistence of poor health outcomes in Indigenous children despite supplementation, evidence that pointed to systemic underfeeding, though officials framed it differently. Instead of confronting the chronic starvation produced by institutional neglect, policymakers emphasized efficiency. Supplements were proof that inexpensive measures could maintain adequate growth, even under conditions of limited rations. The correspondence among administrators reveals the economic priorities underlying these choices. Budgets for residential schools remained meager, and requests for additional funding to improve overall food quality were often denied. Instead, the experimental supplements were portrayed as a solution that avoided larger expenditures. In this way, the studies did not merely observe deprivation, they reinforced it by justifying continued austerity. For the children, the experiments blurred into the larger structure of institutional control. They had no way of distinguishing between medical authority and government power. A doctor's white coat carried the same authority as a principal's orders or a priest's reprimand. Their hunger and their pain were folded into an environment where questioning was impossible. Later testimony described feelings of betrayal when survivors learned, decades on, that their suffering had been orchestrated, recorded, and analyzed as part of national research. Beyond Canada, the professional networks that carried these findings outward tied them into broader currents of 20th-century public health. Philanthropic foundations, government agencies, and universities across North America were engaged in shaping nutrition policy. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Milbank Memorial Fund, and other influential institutions funded projects in medical education, agricultural reform, and health surveys. Though the residential school feeding experiments were principally documented as government and hospital undertakings, they existed within this larger ecosystem of philanthropic science, where indigenous bodies became sites of study for the advancement of nutritional theory. In the communities most affected, the legacy of these years was measured not in publications, but in the consequences borne by survivors. Untreated dental decay carried into adulthood, leading to chronic infections and tooth loss. Weakness and malnutrition stunted growth, leaving some with lifelong health struggles. Emotional scars lingered as well: mistrust of hospitals, fear of medical procedures, anger at being used without consent. These effects did not end with one generation. Families carried the memory of what their children endured, passing down stories of hunger and experiments as warnings to younger kin. The archives from this period are filled with charts and tables, but the human stories break through in testimony. One survivor recalled seeing a sibling given extra milk while they themselves received none, a memory that haunted their relationship for decades. Another described the humiliation of standing unclothed in front of classmates while a doctor took notes, never explaining why. These fragments, once brought into public view, revealed the cost behind the clean data sheets stored in university libraries and government vaults. By the mid-1950s, the experimental studies in the residential schools had formally concluded, but their afterlife stretched across institutions and generations. The researchers who had designed and overseen them returned to their hospitals and universities, where their careers continued. Some became prominent figures in pediatric medicine and nutrition policy, publishing textbooks, advising governments, and shaping the standards by which children's diets across Canada were measured. In their professional biographies, the years of experimentation on Indigenous children were rarely mentioned. The data folded seamlessly into the larger narrative of scientific progress. The Department of Indian Affairs, for its part, absorbed the findings into its administrative logic. Reports summarizing the results were filed under categories such as child welfare and health services, demonstrating that inexpensive supplements could mitigate the worst effects of malnutrition. The official line did not acknowledge that malnutrition itself had been the product of deliberate underfunding and restrictive policies. Instead, the evidence was used to argue that budgets could remain lean so long as certain fortified commodities were supplied. This reasoning justified continued austerity in residential schools, where hunger persisted long after the experiments ended. In Indigenous communities, the experiments were never fully forgotten. Families had seen their children return home for holidays thinner, weaker, or suffering from untreated dental pain. They noticed how some children had been given extra rations while others were denied them, though the reasons were never explained. These observations were transmitted orally, in family stories and community memory, even when the official documents lay hidden in government vaults. Decades later, when the details of the experiments were exposed by historians, survivors recognized in those archival records the validation of what they had always known. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Canada's public health system expanded dramatically, with new investments in hospitals, nutrition programs, and food fortification. The science that guided these reforms often cited work from the 1940s and 1950s, without reference to its origins in Indigenous schools and communities. The knowledge had been generalized, transformed into guidelines for vitamins in milk, fortification of flour, and child growth charts. The children who had supplied the data were absent from the narrative, their role erased even as their suffering had informed national policy. In the same period, philanthropic institutions that had once shaped medical research worldwide continued to expand their influence. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Milbank Memorial Fund, and others were remembered in official histories as patrons of science, medicine, and education. Their archives recorded investments in laboratories, agricultural research, and disease control. What those public accounts did not often include were the ways in which their vision of scientific efficiency had harmonized with government strategies of austerity in colonial contexts. The ethos of cost-effective public health was celebrated, while its human consequences on marginalized populations were rarely confronted. For survivors, the legacy of these years was not abstract but embodied. Chronic dental disease, weakened immune systems, and stunted growth carried into adulthood. Many described mistrust of doctors as a lasting consequence. Hospitals, clinics, and medical researchers were associated not with healing but with invasive examinations and withheld care. In later decades, this mistrust complicated efforts to deliver health services in indigenous communities, as families hesitated to engage with institutions that had once treated their children as subjects rather than patients. Testimonies gathered during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada decades later gave voice to these memories. Survivors spoke of lining up for meals and noticing the differences in what was served. They remembered the taste of powdered milk and the bitterness of cod liver oil. They described the fear of needles, the humiliation of being measured and inspected, and the pain of untreated dental problems. Their stories revealed not only the immediate suffering but also the long shadows cast by those years, shadows of anger, grief, and mistrust that extended across families and communities. In universities and medical schools, new generations of students learned nutrition science as a neutral body of knowledge, unaware that some of its foundations had been laid through ethically compromised experiments. It was only when historians like Ian Mosby began to publish their archival research in the early 21st century that the hidden origins of this knowledge became visible. The revelations shocked the public, provoked apologies from hospitals, and forced a reckoning with how deeply colonial practices were entwined with Canadian science. Yet even then, many records remained incomplete. Entire files had been lost, destroyed, or never created. The absence of explicit consent forms, parental correspondence, or detailed protocols made it difficult to reconstruct every detail. These silences, however, were as telling as the surviving documents. They reflected the broader disregard for Indigenous voices and rights at the time, when officials and researchers did not consider it necessary to record consent or to involve families in decisions about their children's participation. In this way, the experiments lingered both as presence and absence. They were present in the data, the policies, and the careers they had shaped. They were absent in public memory, erased from official histories, and denied to the very communities that had endured them. The contradiction persisted, a body of knowledge celebrated as progress, built on a foundation of exploitation and silence. By the 1970s and 1980s, the experiments themselves were decades in the past, yet their legacies persisted quietly in the health of survivors, in the mistrust that communities carried, and in the unacknowledged data still circulating through medical literature. Government departments filed the records away in federal archives, while researchers moved on to other projects, often citing their earlier work as a foundation without revisiting the means by which it had been gathered. The silence around origins remained deliberate. The less said about the conditions in which the knowledge had been produced, the more comfortably it could be celebrated as neutral science. Meanwhile, survivors began to organize more visibly. Indigenous communities across Canada were confronting the legacy of residential schools in broader terms: forced separation, cultural suppression, abuse, and hunger. Within these accounts, memories of experiments surfaced. Elders told stories of strange routines imposed during their childhood, how some children were given extra food while others went without, how doctors came with needles and instruments, how painful dental conditions were ignored. These accounts were rarely taken seriously outside the community at first. To many officials, They were anecdotal, unverified. But within families, they were consistent, repeated across provinces and across generations. Medical mistrust had become deeply embedded. Health workers in northern communities in the 1970s often reported resistance to routine checkups or reluctance to comply with hospital referrals. Families explained that they feared their children would be taken, examined, or experimented upon. Professionals sometimes dismissed this as superstition or misunderstanding, without recognizing it as a rational response to past trauma. The memory of being used for research without explanation was not easily erased, and its consequences complicated every attempt at building effective health services in indigenous communities. In academic circles, the legacy of the nutrition experiments was visible only in the form of standardized recommendations. Growth charts, vitamin requirements, and fortification policies cited mid-century research as authoritative. Students in medicine and nutrition learned these guidelines without awareness of how they had been obtained. The children whose blood samples had been drawn and whose hunger had been measured had no presence in the classrooms where future doctors trained. Science presented itself as universal, detached from history, even as it rested on the particular suffering of indigenous children. Within the broader global context, philanthropic foundations continued to be celebrated as champions of health. The Rockefeller Foundation and others were credited with advancing international nutrition and agricultural programs, shaping what came to be known as the Green Revolution. Their emphasis on measurable outcomes, cost efficiency, and scalable interventions mirrored the logic that had driven Canadian officials to approve experiments in underfunded schools decades earlier. What connected these arenas was a belief in progress through science, progress measured in numbers, not in human dignity. The 1980s and 1990s brought new forms of activism. Survivors began pressing for acknowledgement, lawsuits against the government and churches gained momentum, and the broader public slowly became aware of the scale of abuse in residential schools. In these testimonies, food and medical experiments surfaced again. Survivors recounted memories of hunger used as a tool of control, of being singled out for strange diets, of untreated dental pain. These accounts were not yet supported by official admissions, but they planted seeds of doubt in the national narrative. They signaled that the story of residential schools was larger than cultural suppression and physical abuse. It also included medical exploitation. In some cases, survivors who had become adults with health complications suspected links to their childhood experiences. Chronic anemia, digestive problems, and weakened immune systems were traced back by families to years of inadequate diets. Dentists treating survivors in middle age sometimes remarked on the extensive damage caused by untreated decay. Yet without access to the archives, survivors could only point to patterns, not proof. The institutions that held the documents remained silent, their files locked in restricted collections. The silences weighed heavily. Families felt that their stories were dismissed because they lacked official records. Researchers outside indigenous communities rarely pursued these leads, fearing that they would be too difficult to substantiate. The effect was to extend the erasure. Knowledge that was preserved in indigenous memory was doubted, while the written archives that could confirm it were withheld. The hierarchy of evidence, written over oral, official over personal, meant that survivors' voices carried little weight in the public sphere, even when their testimonies were consistent across regions and decades. Still, memory endured. Parents and grandparents warned younger generations not to trust hospitals, not to submit to unnecessary tests, not to assume that those in white coats acted with benevolence. These warnings were not paranoia. They were lessons drawn from lived experience. They became part of intergenerational memory, shaping how communities interacted with health systems long after the last feeding trials had ended. The early 2000s brought the documents into the open. In the stacks of Library and Archives Canada, boxes of government correspondence, hospital reports, and interdepartmental memos were examined by researchers determined to uncover the hidden record. The paper trail confirmed what survivors had carried in memory for decades, that systematic nutrition and dental experiments had been conducted on Indigenous children in residential schools from the 1940s into the 1950s, without consent, under conditions of deliberate deprivation. When historian Ian Mosby published his findings in 2013, the details shocked the Canadian public. Headlines spoke of children used as human guinea pigs, of blood samples drawn and rations manipulated in the name of science. For survivors, the revelations were less a surprise than a vindication. The stories they had told, often dismissed as exaggerations, were now anchored by the official documents themselves. What had been oral testimony became irrefutable history. Public reaction forced institutions to respond. Health Canada issued a statement acknowledging the experiments, describing them as regrettable. Churches that had run the schools expressed sorrow, while universities where some of the researchers had worked were pressed to account for their role. Yet the apologies did not erase the consequences, nor did they offer the full measure of responsibility that survivors demanded. The experiments had been part of a larger system of neglect and control, and acknowledgement came only after decades of silence. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission gathered survivor testimony, recording accounts of hunger, examinations, and untreated illness. Witnesses described the pain of having their teeth rot while dentists looked on, the fear of lining up for blood draws, the shame of being studied while left hungry. These testimonies gave emotional depth to the archival record, ensuring that the story was told not only through official reports, but also through lived experience. In communities across the country, the revelations deepened mistrust of medical authority. Elders reminded the young of the lessons learned in their childhoods, to be wary of hospitals, to ask questions, to remember that consent must never again be ignored. The mistrust was not abstract. It was carried in bodies weakened by malnutrition, in mouths that had lost teeth to deliberate neglect, in the memory of being reduced to data points. The legacy of the experiments rippled outward. They highlighted how science had been used as an instrument of colonialism, justifying austerity, advancing careers, and erasing the humanity of Indigenous children. They showed how philanthropic ideals of efficiency and progress had dovetailed with state control to create conditions where harm was not only tolerated but designed. And they revealed how the voices of those most affected had been silenced for decades, only to be heard when paper records confirmed their truth. Survivors continued to speak, insisting that acknowledgement was not enough. They wanted accountability, reparations, and education. They wanted future generations to understand what had been done to them, so that silence could no longer protect institutions. The experiments had ended in the 1950s, but their consequences remained alive in memory, in health, and in the structures of mistrust that shaped relations between Indigenous peoples and Canadian institutions. The story, once hidden, now circulates in classrooms, reports, and public discussions. It is carried in the words of survivors who endured hunger and harm in the name of science, and in the documents that record how those harms were justified in the language of policy. It persists as testimony to the costs of treating children as subjects rather than human beings, a reminder of how authority and science, unchecked by ethics or consent, can wound generations. History doesn't fade. It waits to be uncovered. Stay with us, subscribe, and be part of the journey here on Eternal Obsidian.